Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good morning from a beautiful spring day in Washington, D.C. Welcome to today's Thursday Talk. Our Thursday Talks aim to bring you the best and most innovative learning there is in the peace building field and beyond. Whether this is your first Thursday Talk or you're one of our regular participants, it's great to have you with us today. My name is Jennifer Howell, and I am the Communications and Learning Officer at Search for Common Ground and the communications lead for DME for Peace. I will be moderating today's session. So today our discussion is focusing on livestock migration and conflict, tools for designing interventions. And I am delighted to welcome Andrew McDonnell, who is Senior Officer of Global Policy and Outreach at Search for Common Ground. Many thanks for joining us today, Andrew, and for leading our discussion. Just to note about how we will spend our time together, as Andrew is presenting, you can write your question using the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A portion. When you do that, also please try to write your name and affiliation if you are able. That way we can attribute your questions to you. So with that, let me hand it over to Andrew today. All right, Andrew, take it away.
Thanks so much, Jen, and thanks so much to everyone else joining us this morning. I'm here to talk a bit about a new project and toolkit that just came out from Search for Common Ground, which focuses on improving the design of interventions around conflict dynamics associated with cross-border pastoralism, particularly within sub-Saharan Africa. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, when we talk about pastoralism, we're referring to a system of livestock production, of raising livestock, in which they are mobile in some fashion, and so that usually refers to, or often refers to, practices of taking cattle or goats, other sort of livestock, on regular migration in order to access water or access grazing, which is a particularly common practice in places where those kinds of resources are not available year-round in the same place. And this has been a long-standing practice in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in the Sahel and Sudano-Sahel ecological zones, but has also been the cause for or associated with conflict, both on an interpersonal level and more broadly. So I'm going to talk to you just a bit about this toolkit that we've developed, the needs that it's serving in designing more effective interventions, and what we've learned in this process. So as I just mentioned, this practice of regular seasonal migration of livestock has been closely tied or manifests in a number of different conflicts that we see happening, sprouting up across the Sudano-Sahel. Whether we're talking about insurgencies in the Western Sahel and Liptako-Gorma Triangle, in which, among other things, we have pastoral communities who have been systematically excluded from access to resources, or who have otherwise been in tensions with other communal groups, or whether we're talking about sort of interpersonal disputes between local farmers and passing pastoralists who end up in disputes because passing cattle will either destroy or consume crops, or because farmers will begin cultivating in areas that have historically been used by cattle on migration, or whether we're talking about in places like Central African Republic or in Sudan or South Sudan, where cattle are regularly targeted by armed groups or other pastoral communities for theft or for exploitation, because they're a very lucrative source of income. So in all these various ways, we see pastoralism cropping up again and again in the midst of some of these key conflict dynamics. And it's closely intertwined with a lot of broader trends across the region, closely connected to the changing climate and erratic rainfall that's making it more difficult for livestock owners to find the right water or resources or grazing for their cows, whether it's land tenure laws changing and evolving as various local and national governments aim to privatize or further develop land that maybe historically was used by pastoralists or was historically owned communally, or whether we're talking about sort of wider tensions over large-scale agricultural development as various parts of the region struggle with food insecurity. All of these, we're seeing pastoralism and conflict sitting at the nexus between all of these different sort of dimensions of conflict, creating a real need for a more intentional focus on this kind of phenomenon. At the same time, we're seeing a number of gaps in the way that peace builders and other peace builders, development agencies are responding to these conflict dynamics. The first being that as a community, many of our sort of best practices in peace building, our approaches to peace building, were really designed for sedentary populations, communities that were neighbors who lived next to each other year round, who could be brought together on a regular basis in people-to-people programs, or who could sit together in a joint peace committee, and are not adapted to the needs of populations that are regularly mobile, to nomadic or semi-nomadic populations, who, can't necessarily show up to attend a local peace committee meeting because they're not necessarily living in the same place year round. The second gap is that the wider investments in stability and development are not necessarily aimed at addressing the root causes of conflict that we're seeing across the region. We saw, for example, in the 1980s, in the wake of the major Sahelian drought, massive investments being put into retraining people in crop production and agriculture as a way to create more resilience against an unstable climate and to ensure better food security for the region. But a secondary consequence of that is that you saw a massive expansion of crop production and agricultural land, which brought communities into tension with pastoralists who who had traditionally been able to move their livestock through that land to access water, to access grazing, and now we're seeing more constrictions in their movement. And so you can see there some tensions between our priorities for development or conservation and our priorities for conflict prevention. And then last but not least, is that many of the organizations and people who are designing these interventions to prevent conflict or development or conservation don't necessarily have access to easy to understand guidance about best practices in the prevention of conflict around pastoralism. This is often, one small part of the program or portfolio for many staff or experts. If you are a foreign service officer just being transferred from Southeast Asia into the embassy in Bamako, and you may not be an existing expert in livestock and livestock migration, but all of a sudden, this is, you begin to hear and see about tensions between nomadic populations and sedentary groups. And while there's a great deal of information out there about pastoralism, we found in our existing literature review on the subject some 600 sources that have been published even just within the past 10 to 15 years. A lot of that is information that isn't necessarily sort of actionable and accessible to people who are just looking to understand, what can I do about this within my own community? And so that's where this toolkit comes in. It was designed as a reference point for anyone developing interventions around pastoralism and conflict across the Sudan-Sahel, to give them access to best practices and lessons learned from the region. We sent around a copy of the toolkit, so hopefully some of you have had a chance to take a look. What went into this was a meta-analysis of literature, both academic literature and program evaluations, program reports, again, looking at sources from across the region, across different disciplines, as well as a number of consultations with pastoralist activists, donor agencies, local practitioners working in the Sudan-Sahel. To give you a sense of sort of what's inside the toolkit itself, I'm actually going to turn over real quickly. We have both a PDF toolkit that has been shared with everyone, but we also, in order to make this guidance a bit more accessible, created an interactive website, which you can find off of the DMNE for Peace website. So if you are watching me on the screen now, you can find it under Pastoralism and Conflict Toolkit. And you can see here, we have we developed a series of 7 modules, which are all aimed at approaching this problem from different sectors and a different lens, recognizing that no one actor or community really has sole responsibility or can address this issue alone. So we have everything ranging from conflict management and peace building to rural development to gender and women's empowerment, to the governance and rule of law, which all look at this issue from different lenses and offer a different set of intervention strategies. So just going into one, for you as the reader, our aim was not to provide any one prescriptive approach to how to tackle this conflict across the varied contexts from Mali to South Sudan, but instead to give people access to a menu of options and an understanding of what's been working across the region and what hasn't been working. And so here in the rural development section, for example, we have a number of strategies for intervention where we highlight lessons learned as well as different case studies from across the field. So I invite you to check that out if you haven't already, and to explore through different modules and different strategies. So just to wrap up, I'll highlight a few sort of key overarching lessons that we learned in the process of doing this. The first, which I've already touched on, I think, a few times, is that conflict prevention needs to be integrated into all sectors who are working on pastoralism, rather than being treated as a standalone objective. If you imagine, for example, that you're a livestock herder in Chad who comes into conflict with a local farmer over who has control over a piece of land, who's able to take their cattle through, is it allowed to be used for crop cultivation. You can take that dispute to a local mediation committee or a trusted community leader to come to a resolution and maybe agree that the farmland is allowed to extend only to a certain area, and that there's a mutually agreed upon corridor or section for livestock to pass through. But what happens then when that land is when the status of that land changes, when the government decides to either sell that land for private development or to update land tenure laws to allow others within the community to lay claim to that territory, all of a sudden, that corridor isn't necessarily protected. Even if that doesn't happen, that agreement between two individuals, is that necessarily supported by the sort of broader development of that region? Do investments in development support, building a fence along that corridor, or building signs that recognize the legitimacy of that agreement? And so if there's a disconnect between the way that we're approaching local conflict resolution and our broader objectives in development, conservation, governance reforms, then we'll see that all the good work that's being done to help mediate tensions at a local level can come undone, which will have a much broader impact beyond just two individuals in conflict. We're talking about when we talk about pastoralism, we're talking about a livelihood that supports over 100 million people across the Sahel region, and to say nothing as well of the millions who depend on farming and crop production. And so this is goes much beyond sort of individual disputes, and really is at the heart of the future of food production and rural development in the region. The second is that the challenges that we face with pastoralism and cross-border pastoralism in particular forces us, I think, to rethink how we approach security within the region. If you are taking your cattle to be sold at a local border town, and they're stolen and taken across the border, who do you turn to be able to recover them? Can you go to the border security and raise that complaint? Will they even listen to you? If you can and you do trust the border security in your country, do they have any means of communicating and coordinating with partners in the neighboring country where your cattle are actually taken? Is there any hope that your cattle will actually be recovered? And so just the very nature of this sort of regular movement through space and movement across borders, I think requires that we sort of fundamentally rethink some of the challenges we have around security. And then last but not least is that pastoral and nomadic communities need to be treated as stakeholders, which in many ways they often aren't in the process of designing or implementing new programs or new initiatives. If you are going into build a well in a town in Central African Republic, you may, of course, go and consult with local leaders, local stakeholders, and may not think, maybe I should also reach out to, the herders and pastoralists who live in Chad or Sudan, who pass through this region and who also depend on access to water, and who are also stakeholders in water access, but who aren't there. They aren't necessarily in the same town year round. They may not be easily accessible and may not be easily visible. And so we see that pastoral and nomadic communities can often be sort of left behind as stakeholders in favor of those who are more immediately visible or more immediately accessible. And so all of this requires that we think more intentionally about the needs and interests of these kinds of communities as we're going about design and implementation. So a lot more, there's a lot more findings and analysis and within the toolkit, but this I think is just to give you a kind of brief snapshot of some of the things that we're learning in this process. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We have a lot of questions coming in already, and I want to say thank you to everyone who is already sending in some great things for us to talk about. But in the meantime, sorry, 1 second, I want to go over how to send in questions to us in the Q&A portion if you haven't done it before. So just a note to let you know, we will be sharing these presentation slides and the important links with you. I put a link to the toolkit in the chat function and sent it out to everyone if you haven't seen that already. And also just a warning that we post this recording on DME for Peace, which I will do by the end of this week. So you can go back and reference this conversation there. So now to the Q&A portion of our discussion. A couple of notes about our format. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks, you can submit a question or comment in two ways. The first is through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live. When you submit a question for us, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation, if you can, so I can reference the question back to you. And I also want to say, fair warning, like I always do, I will try my best to pronounce your names correctly, and I truly, truly apologize for any mistakes I made. And just to note, as I said before, these talks are recorded and put on our website. So for those who are not able to join us can go back and listen. So let's get started. We have lots of questions coming in, and you can keep all sending them in while we are doing the Q&A portion. First, I want to say that Grant Belongashane mentioned that, Andrew, you said there you were listing the countries, or you showed on the map of the ones being influenced or having conflicts influenced by pastoralism, and Grant just wanted to mention Eastern DRC too. So I don't remember if that was on the map. I don't know if you want to speak to that, if it is missing as to the thought behind that, but
I'll just briefly say that this specific map is comes to us from the armed conflict from ACLID, the armed conflict and
just
events
as Eastern DRC
and
within the websites.
Yeah. So the this is tracking specifically the deaths in conflicts in which one of the parties is described as pastoralists. It's not necessarily comprehensive of all conflict events that might fit into this this category, but you do see this coming up in Eastern DRC. You can see a few dots on this map, and this certainly is a conflict dynamic in DRC as well as in other parts of Central and Eastern Africa.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for clarifying. We have a question in from Mary Dulson. Mary asks, what do you mean by investments in stability? And is stability the goal, or society that can withstand and respond without violence to various shocks/events? So is this stability the goal, or is it a society that can withstand and respond to these events that might arise?
It's a good question, Mary, and I think here I'm sort of using that as a catch-all to describe a lot of different types of work, and I think a big part of the problem is fundamentally that a lot of the work being done in this region obviously is not all being done towards the same end, and so when we're talking about programs or initiatives that that engage with pastoralists or that focus on pastoralism, not all of them are aimed at fostering stability. I mean, in other cases where the sort of end goal is to build resilience to climate change, or to improve food security, or to improve animal health, or to improve sort of livelihoods and economic opportunities for pastoralists or other rural communities. And so they're not all, we're talking about sort of programs, initiatives that have overlapping, but not all the same types of goals. And I think part of the challenge that we see is that you end up having a lot of people doing sort of overlapping work and overlapping with the same communities, but not working towards the same end. And so at times, this kind of work can be counterproductive. To just give, I think, one example, one of the tensions that you see in some areas is that the movement of pastoralists through protected land, land that's protected for conservation purposes, can put endangered wildlife at risk, either as pastoralists engage in poaching, or just the sort of adverse effects on the local ecology. And so from the perspective of people who are trying to protect and preserve local wildlife, they may be in favor of restricting and shutting down the movement of pastoralists. And so their aim is not necessarily to prevent conflict, but efforts to restrict the movement of pastoralists through that kind of land where they have depended on, or in order to survive, can end up in flaring or exacerbating conflict. And so I think the real lesson or headline is that we need to be thinking about how this kind of work that seemingly that right now is being done towards different ends, different goals, should be better aligned. And we need to think about and not just think about, but we need to look for more opportunities to create common goals between, conservation and conflict prevention, between long-term rural development and agricultural development, and social cohesion um, between local producers.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Also, thank you, Mary. And Mary is from GHR Foundation, just to clarify. I also have a few questions from Pramod Sharma, and Pramod says, good evening, team. So the question is around what other technical options can be, what other technical options are there to help prevent or create like less movement across borders, or to encourage it, I believe is the question. What are like the technical options that we can potentially enforce? That's not the right word. Sorry. I don't know if that makes sense, Andrew. I can try to rephrase it if you get the
Sure. So,
general idea.
I
Okay.
think that this is a major debate happening across sub-Saharan Africa right now, as particularly in the vein of thinking about how um, uh, countries and regions can be more integrated economically, and through sort of inter-regional trade. The big flagship, for those of you who are familiar with this subject, the big flagship in the region has been the 1998 ECOWAS Transhumans Protocols, which establishes an agreement between ECOWAS member states, that the movement of livestock between those states should be free, and establishes a whole sort of administrative system of how to govern that kind of movement, to resolve conflict, to check up on animal health, and to make sure that they're protecting against illicit trade and illicit movement. And so there is a model. There are models out there. There's been a lot of concerns and criticism over the years of that particular protocol, which is now more than 20 years old, because while it exists on paper, that doesn't necessarily mean that it exists in reality, and that you're not necessarily seeing a consistent level of commitment across all regions, across all member states, to making those provisions really happen, whether that means investing in border checkpoints and training local border patrol agents so that they are familiar with the rules in place, or aligning national legislation so that it actually fits with the sort of regional agreements. But this continues to be a major debate. And earlier this year, the IGAD region in East Africa passed their own transhumance protocols, which are similar in nature, establishing sort of free movement of livestock across IGAD member states. So there are technical models and approaches out there, but I think the big headline that I would highlight is that we also have to be aware that that we can't just have solutions that make sense on paper, but we also need to make sure that those solutions are happening in reality, that they have the support and investment in making sure that they are actually sort of realized in practice.
Sure, great. So this kind of touches upon what you just covered a bit, but perhaps you want to expand on it. It's a bit twofold. I'm going to combine two questions together. Another one is from Pramod Sharma, and Pramod is asking, which again you sort of touched on, but are there certain things that people or governments at destinations during these migrations, at the destination points, that they can do to prepare if they know this arrival of migrating people will be coming their way. And also with that, speaking of options, is any one of the options that can be used surrounding maybe improving pastoralism in the spot that they already are, to help reduce conflicts between the pastoralists and farmers?
To the second half of that point, I think you do see there's been a number of investments in, for example, Nigeria, where investments in the creation of ranches or other like grazing reserves to allow local Nigerian pastoralists to have a sort of dedicated space in which they can raise cattle without having to take them on migration. The feasibility of that obviously will vary both between different communities, whether they buy in, but also between different sort of environments and ecological zones. Because the reason that this system of raising livestock exists in the first place is because in many cases it's ecologically necessary, because there just isn't enough rainfall in certain places year round to be able to support livestock. The regular movement of livestock also allows communities to avoid overtaxing a given area, given land and resources. There has been some investments to try to create to create better solutions from an ecological perspective, but we also shouldn't necessarily think that there's going to be a future in which that kind of flexible system doesn't exist. But to the first half of your question, I mean, we see this happening a lot across the region. It's happened a lot historically. I'm thinking, for example, about there's an example cited in our research about communities in South Sudan where the pastoral communities would send somebody ahead to the sort of local village or local farming community several days in advance of when the cattle would arrive, to just let them know, our migration has started, we're going to come in a few days, prepare as you need. And those kinds of efforts can really help in helping to prevent and mitigate conflict. And these have all sort of emerged, a lot of these sort of local customary practices have emerged over centuries and centuries of pastoral practice. And the problem that we're seeing right now is not so much that we don't have a model for doing that, because many communities do, but for one reason or another, a lot of those practices have sort of broken down. And in the case of South Sudan, for example, those kinds of practices can be more difficult when we're also now talking about communities that are moving across the Sudan-South Sudan border, or talking about communities who need to move through area where armed groups are active and who don't feel safe and secure, or where the relationship between the pastoral ethnic group or clan has deteriorated and eroded with their sort of neighboring village or neighboring farming community, in the context of wider civil war and conflict. And so that those lines of communication similarly will erode and break down. And so I think that's a big part of the challenge that you see across the region, is that there are a lot of these good practices and good models, but they're just facing stressors that they've never had to face before.
Great, thank you. Speaking of impact, we have a question surrounding the impact on women specifically during these cross-border movements. Sort of what have you seen? Is there a specific impact to women due to these conflicts and also movement as a whole? And additionally, I'm just going to tag onto it so you can address both. We have a question from Roba Gilo, who is a graduate student and also a shepherd from Ethiopia. And Ropa asks, basically referencing the climate crisis, and do you believe the climate change has exacerbated or impacted the situation, or is it mostly about policy? So kind of a twofold. I'm just impact related questions. The first one on women and women groups, and the second on has the climate change specifically impacted or exacerbated pastoral related conflict.
So to the question about women and impact on women, and there is one of our 7 modules is focused entirely on gender and women's empowerment. So I'd invite you to check that out. And there's a lot of other good resources that we link to within the toolkit that give sort of more explanation. But in short, you know, when we're talking about the impact of these conflicts on women, you know, I think similar to other conflicts we've seen across the region, that women in many pastoral communities, in many more traditional pastoral communities, don't necessarily have the same sort of access to livelihood opportunities and other sort of services that you might see in that are particularly more available to sort of people living year-round in the same village or community. And so when their spouse or relatives are lost are killed in conflict or otherwise impacted by conflict, that all of a sudden they face an enormous burden in having to provide for their families without having the same sort of opportunities to livelihood opportunities that others have. And at the same time, you know, we've seen pastoralism, conflicts related to pastoralism have displaced communities in various parts of the region, which obviously has a significant impact on women and children as they're forced to sort of pick up and get themselves set up elsewhere. There have been some reports of sexually based violence being sort of instrumentalized as part of cycles of revenge between pastoral and farming communities. Although I say that with only some hesitation, because I think there hasn't yet been enough sort of research and data collected on this issue, and it's a subject in which there needs to be a lot more sort of credible, objective research done. On the last point about climate, I'll just quickly say that this is a topic that we touch on in the toolkit, as well as we released last year a literature review on the same subject and talked on that in more detail. And my short answer is climate change is exacerbating some of the underlying drivers of conflict, access to resources, the just general scarcity of resources as populations increase. But I think too often people will draw this sort of causal line. You know, the headline in news stories will be that, you know, climate change is causing conflict and wars in Africa. And I think that the research does not bear that out in terms of there being a direct link that climate change necessarily causes conflict. And then it's more often the case that you know, conflicts are really about the fact that communities don't have good, credible, trusted systems for governing and managing resources in a way that's fair, equitable, and that's the sort of more acute cause of conflict. but that obviously that gets a lot worse when all of a sudden there's scarcer resources to go around, or when there's severe weather events like drought or flooding. And so climate matters, but it's also, we should be careful not to overstate it as the immediate acute cause of all conflict.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Keeping in mind our 45-minute time limit, I am going to have us go a little bit over today, and I recognize if you are not able to stay with us, but there are just a couple more questions that I do want to get to. So Andrew, I apologize. I'm going to do the double question again just because we have so many great ones coming in. So my first batch of questions that I'm going to give you now have to do with content, and the second group after you're done answering those will kind of have to do more about certain things that are included in the toolkit that you've shared with us today. Okay, so the first group of questions has to do with some of the interventions. So Matt Bure has asked, or has stated, there have been various interventions undertaken to resolve the current pastoral farmer dispute in the Sahel. But these interventions, including some interventions that are recommended in the toolkit, have not ended the disputes. What are your thoughts on why, perhaps? I know that is a large question, so answer where you can with that. And additionally, Matt asked about the relationship between pastoral farmer disputes and jihadist violence in the Sahel.
So to the first question, I would distinguish between, there's been a lot of interventions that are successful on a certain scale and level. I think that we can point to a number of case studies within the toolkit where we've seen, particularly on a communal level, where communities have been able to come together even in the midst of conflict and find better, more constructive ways of resolving disputes and sort of ending ongoing cycles of revenge and retaliatory violence. But that doesn't necessarily, those successes at a local level don't necessarily translate into ending of all farmer-herder conflict widely. And it is important to note, conflicts or tensions between farmers and herders and other resource users are to some extent inevitable when you have communities that are sharing resources in shared land. Conflicts are going to come up for one reason or the other, and in small cases we've seen interventions that have helped communities deal with those conflicts effectively, but on a wider scale, I don't think that we're seeing that same kind of success. And to me, again, a big part of that is just because there is a disconnect between our goals, the goals of our work and our interventions in local conflict resolution, local mediation, and the sort of broader investments in agricultural development and livestock development. And if we really want to see a truly transformative change in conflict, then conflict needs to be a major consideration as we plan, to systematically rethink rural development, food production, trade across the wider region. And so it's a big problem that requires action at a lot of different levels, which just hasn't happened yet, but hopefully will as there's a sort of greater recognition of this challenge. And then to the second part of the question about the link with jihadist violence, a lot has been made of there's been a lot written and said about the connection between pastoralist groups and various insurgent groups, particularly in West Africa, but also in Central and Eastern Africa. Um, and again, this is a subject we cover in the toolkit as well as in our literature reviews, so you can read more there. I think the short answer is there are some insurgent groups across the region that have targeted pastoralists and tried to appeal to the political grievances that pastoralists have, as they've been excluded politically and economically. And so you do see pastoralists as individuals and as groups who may join or participate in some insurgent groups. But it's also important to note that this connection between pastoralism and insurgency has also been overstated or overhyped in the media and used sometimes to justify exclusionary politics towards pastoralist communities writ large. Pastoralists are like any other people in West Africa who have frustrations and grievances and who, participate in armed violence for economic opportunities or social reasons. And so I think we just also need to be cautious not to reinforce the narrative that we see sometimes in media and in policy discussions that that pastoralist groups are inherently more inclined to violence or more inclined to participate in armed violence, because the connection is much more complicated and much more complicated than I can do justice for in a few minutes. But again, it's a subject that we cover in our research, so I'd invite you to read more there.
Is the literature review also, can that be found on the website Digital Toolkit?
It can. We do have a whole section of additional resources for those of you who are interested in checking it out. And that includes our literature review as well.
Great,
down
yeah.
here at the bottom.
There are a few topics that we were sent that we didn't have time to cover, and I just wanted to ask if they're also included, if the website is someplace that they can go to find this information. It has to do with is conflict, or how it relates, or how pastoralism relates to conflict in Sudan and South Sudan. Is that presented in the website toolkit that people can go find? And also another area that we were asked about, the main actors, the dividers and connectors in pastoralist and farmer conflicts. Is that also information that our listeners can find on the website?
You can find some information on both those things looking through the website. The toolkit was designed to be sort of to capture wider trends across the region, and doesn't necessarily go into specific analysis about any one given context. But you will find a lot of good references in book literature review and on the website on both of those questions. But for those of you who are interested, you can also, as I said, look through our library of other resources and check out. We have a interactive map where we're plotting programs and interventions that have been conducted across the region, and where you might be able to find more information on sort of specific contexts and specific regions. So invite you to check out all of that.
Great. Mary Dolson did ask if the toolkit includes a list of policies from ECOWAS or AU or individual countries.
We do have a short list of regional policies on the cross-border movement of livestock, and particularly here in our section on regional integration.
Okay, great. Just seeing that we have to wrap up now, we did have a question about are there plans for this to be translated into French? And that has been a big question that we've been getting about the toolkit, and I wanted to open up this space, Andrew, for you to address language translations before we depart today.
Yes, we expect to have a French language version released in May. So look forward to that. We'll share as well, again, with those on this call and those who've been interested in this subject. So we look forward to that. The website will also be available in French in May.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to say there are a couple questions we didn't get to, but I will make sure that Andrew gets those questions so he can respond if he is able to. I also want to say thank you everyone for sticking around this long. Andrew actually has a survey for you. It should only take a couple minutes, and it would really help us all out at a search to know how you found the toolkit and if you found it useful and in what ways. I've looked at the survey. It is brief, but it would be really helpful for us. Additionally, I earlier did share the link to the toolkit. If you want to check, sorry, I cannot speak. If you want to check your chat box, the links to both the survey and the toolkit are there, and you should also be receiving both these links in a follow-up email that you will get in about a day or so from GoToWebinar for attending this discussion. So in closing, a special thank you again to our host, Andrew, and everyone who could join us today. Thank you all for listening in, for sticking with us until 11 o'clock today for the whole hour. We really appreciate it, and it's been a great conversation. And thank you for sharing your thoughts and questions with us. This recording and additional helpful website links will be posted with the webinar recording on the DME for Peace website. And again, just a reminder, that's where you can find the toolkit as well. And this will be done by the end of the week. The toolkit is there now, but the recording will be put up by the end of this week under the M&E Thursday Talk section so that you are able to return to it and share it with your colleagues. Also, please feel free to continue the discussion online in the comments section. So that's it for us today. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to have a Thursday Talk discussion with Peace Direct. So keep your eyes open for upcoming announcements on our website and social media channels. Well, that's it for me today. And thank you again so much for joining us. And I hope that you all have a great rest of your day. And thank you, Andrew, very much.